"Whoever defeats me will take my daughters as wives," said the Apache chief, "until a white man." Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The sun was falling behind Juniper Mesa. Its light stretched long across the ground, flattening every shadow. A circle of men stood in the clearing, boots planted firm in the dust, their faces waiting for the old Apache leader to speak. The air carried smoke from nearby fires and the sharp smell of sweat and leather. The silence was heavy, broken only by the wind pushing through the juniper trees at the edge of the open ground. The leader stepped forward. His body was marked by age, muscles still present under his skin, but loosened by years of fighting and hunger. His black hair, streaked with white, fell around his face as he leaned on a carved staff. He raised his chin and spoke with a voice that cut across the ring. "Whoever defeats me will take my daughters as wives." The men around him shifted their weight, but none spoke. His word was law here. Even if his body showed, he no longer had the strength to stand long against any challenger. Behind him stood 3 women, his daughters. The eldest, Tallulah, carried herself tall, her jaw tight, her dark eyes fixed on the ground. She crossed her arms as though to cover herself, her torn dress slipping at the shoulder, fabric ripped high along one thigh. Pride held her upright, but her shoulders stiffened each time a man's gaze landed on her. The youngest, Naya, looked no older than 22. Her hands shook as she clutched a ragged blanket around her thin frame. She avoided every eye, breathing fast, her body ready to shrink back from the circle if there was anywhere to go. The middle daughter, Ayana, 24, stood still, eyes locked ahead. Her dress hung loose at the seams, the split fabric showing the shape of her body where it had worn thin. She did not move to cover herself. Her stare held steady, not in defiance, but in a kind of weary challenge. It was not the posture of someone choosing her fate, but of someone unwilling to flinch from it. The circle waited. The daughters waited. From the edge of the men, a figure stepped forward. Daniel Kane. He was 35, a white man with a soldier's past stamped across him. His face carried a long scar running across his cheekbone, a reminder of war and close violence. His body was lean from years of travel, shoulders straight, movements careful. He wore an old Union cavalry coat, patched and sun-bleached, boots that showed the road in every crease. His hat was pulled low, shading eyes that rarely gave anything away. Daniel had been in the territory only weeks, moving from one town to another, taking small jobs when a need rose, fixing fences, breaking horses, hauling freight. He had not come here looking for a fight. He had not come for women. He had come to the circle because the words spoken by the old chief reached him on the wind, and he had seen the women standing there. Eyes lowered, dresses torn, futures stripped to a bargain made in front of men. Something in him refused to walk away. He stepped into the open ground. The men watched. The old leader raised his head, his eyes narrowing. Daniel pulled off his hat, set it carefully on the dirt, and raised his hands. "I'll stand." He didn't say more. He didn't explain himself. He couldn't. Even in his own mind, he wasn't sure if this was about defiance, pity, or a chance to do something that might tip the weight of his own guilt into balance. He only knew he couldn't watch them handed over like cattle. The fight started sharp. The old chief swung first with his staff, the wood cracking against Daniel's forearm. Daniel took the blow, teeth grinding, then pushed forward. They grappled, the chief fast for his age, his strikes precise, but his body slowed by years. Daniel matched him, one block, one strike, every move controlled. Dust rose under their boots. The circle tightened. Daniel's mind was steady but strained. He did not want to hurt the man. He did not want to carry another killing. He shifted, took hold of the staff, twisted hard. The old chief lost footing. Daniel swept his leg and dropped him hard to the ground, pinning his arm against the dirt. The old man struggled, but Daniel held him there, firm, not brutal. He could have broken the bone, could have pressed his knee to his throat. Instead, he held him still until the fight drained out. Only then did he let go and step back. The leader lay staring up at the sky, his chest heaving. The law was clear. He was beaten. His daughters, by the words he had spoken, now belonged to the victor. The crowd was silent. Men shifted their eyes to the women, then to Daniel. Daniel bent, picked up his hat, and set it back on his head. His voice was flat, carrying no triumph, no claim. "They come with me." He turned to the women. Each looked at him with something different in their eyes. Fear, suspicion, the faintest trace of hope. He gathered the shawls from the ground and handed them back to them, one by one. His eyes never lingered on the torn places in their clothes. Then he walked out of the circle. He did not look back at the men. He did not look at the leaders still on the ground. He only listened for the sound of footsteps. They followed. The eldest first, shoulders squared. The youngest second, clutching her blanket. The middle one last, her gaze flicking between him and her father until the old man gave the slightest nod. Daniel's chest tightened as he heard their steps behind him. He had no plan beyond this moment. Only one thought sat firm in his mind. Whatever their future held, it would not be decided in a circle of men by a fight and a law. Daniel led the three women away from the circle, his boots striking the hard earth with a rhythm that steadied his own nerves even as questions pressed in from every side of his thoughts. He did not know if the men behind them would follow. He did not know how long the old chief's silence would hold. He did know that turning back meant surrendering them to whatever came next, and that was not an option. The women walked a half step behind him, close enough that he heard their breathing, but far enough to keep distance, unsure if they should trust him or only follow because there was no other path. The trail wound down toward the foothills, light fading fast. Daniel had left his horse tied at a wash not far from here, but there was no wagon, no spare mount. They would have to walk. He slowed his pace, turning once to check their footing. The youngest, Naya, stumbled more than once, the blanket around her shoulders slipping. Daniel handed her his canteen without a word. She drank, water spilling down her chin, then passed it to her eldest sister, Tallulah. The middle one, Ayanna, held it last, her eyes fixed on him as she drank, steady and searching, as though trying to read why he had stepped forward in that circle at all. He looked away before her question could form. By the time the ridge broke and the small valley opened, the moon had climbed above the trees. Daniel's cabin stood in the shadow of the pines, a low shape of logs with a lean-to sagging at one side, a corral half fallen, and a fence missing rails. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. He had left that morning without tending the fire. He stopped at the door, lifted the latch, and stepped aside. Inside, the women hesitated, each glancing at the others. It was the eldest who moved first, her back straight, as if daring him to make use of the right he now legally held. She crossed the threshold, and the others followed, pulling the door shut behind them. The cabin was plain, a stove against the far wall, a table with two chairs, a narrow bed, a cot, a single shelf holding a dented tin cup and a chipped plate. The floor was swept, the corners bare. Daniel set about lighting a fire. He crouched at the stove, striking flint against steel until sparks caught on the dry bark, coaxing flame to life. When the heat began to push into the room, the women pressed closer. The youngest folded herself by the wall, knees drawn to her chest. The eldest stayed standing, arms folded tight. The middle one watched him without looking away. "You'll eat," Daniel said finally, his voice rough from the fight and from hours without speaking. He pulled a sack of beans and a strip of dried venison from the shelf, set them on the table, and filled a pot with water from the bucket. He worked without looking at them directly, not wanting to crowd them further. The silence stretched. Then Ayanna spoke, her voice low but steady. "Why did you fight?" Daniel stirred the pot, eyes fixed on the rising steam. The truth pressed against his chest. He had not fought for law or reward, but because he had seen despair in her face and could not bear to let it stand. But words like that, raw and bare, would not serve. He answered simply, "Because it had to be stopped." Tallulah's eyes narrowed. "Stop for us or for yourself?" He met her stare, held it. "For both." It wasn't enough, but it was honest, and that seemed to quiet her. When the stew thickened, he placed bowls on the table and set out spoons. He took nothing for himself until they each had a share. The eldest ate stiffly, the youngest in quick bites as though fearing the food might vanish. And the middle one with careful, measured movements, her eyes still locked on him between mouthfuls. Daniel ate last, his hunger dulled by the weight in the room. When the bowls were empty, he laid 3 blankets by the stove. "You'll sleep warm here. I'll keep watch at the door." The youngest looked up sharply. "You won't." She stopped, unable to finish the thought. Daniel shook his head. "No." That single word seemed to settle the question none of them had dared ask. He took his rifle, sat with his back against the doorframe, and stretched his legs out. His eyes stayed open long after theirs closed. He heard the shift of bodies on the floor, the restless stirring of women and used as safety, and he thought of the scar that burned across his cheek, how it had come from holding the line in battles that never brought peace. Tonight was no different. He had won a fight that solved nothing yet, except that 3 women were not in the hands of men who would use them as spoils. Still, doubt gnawed at him. Why did he have to bring them here? What if the tribe came down in force by morning? What if the law of the territory decided his act was theft, not rescue? He had no answers. He only knew he would not give them back. And so the cabin held 4 strangers bound by one night's choice. 3 women lying with their eyes closed but minds still racing, and 1 man sitting stiff against a cold door, listening to the fire crackle and the sound of steady breathing, reminding himself he had done the only thing he could. The first gray light slipped through the cracks in the shutters, cutting lines across the cabin floor. Daniel shifted against the doorframe, stiff from a night spent sitting upright with the rifle laid across his lap. His eyes burned from lack of sleep, but he had not allowed himself to drift. He had listened through the long hours, to the soft movements of the 3 women, to the occasional crack of wood in the stove, to every sound outside that might have meant trouble coming down from the mesa. None had. The silence of the land held. When he stood, boots creaking on the floorboards, the youngest stirred first. Naya blinked up at him, her eyes wide, clutching the blanket as though expecting it to be pulled from her at any moment. He crouched, set the rifle aside, and spoke low, steady. "It's morning. You're safe here." His voice came out rough, but gentler than he had intended. She nodded once and lowered her eyes again. The eldest, Tallulah, rose next. Her back was straight, her face unreadable. She brushed dust from her torn dress, refusing to show fatigue even though the shadows under her eyes gave her away. She looked around the cabin with a sharp eye, taking in the stove, the cot, the table, the shelves, measuring not just what was there, but what was missing. Finally, her gaze landed on Daniel. "You live here alone?" He nodded. "Been years that way." She gave a short breath that was half a laugh, half disbelief. "And now 3 more under your roof." Her tone carried challenge, but also a kind of reluctant acceptance of reality. Daniel didn't rise to it. "It isn't much, but it's dry. There's food enough if we keep careful." Ayana, the middle one, had been quiet the longest. She sat upright now, legs folded under her, hair loose down her shoulders. She studied him with that same searching look she'd given him the night before. Steady, unblinking, as though she meant to find the truth in him no matter how deeply he tried to bury it. Finally, she spoke. "What happens now?" Daniel hesitated. He knew the question would come, but he hadn't shaped an answer. He reached for the coffee pot, poured water in, and set it on the stove before answering. "Now, you decide if you stay here, or leave when you're ready." Tallulah's eyes narrowed. "You say that, but the law of the circle said different. By their word, we're yours." Daniel met her stare. "Their word doesn't hold here. I didn't fight for law. I fought to stop what I saw. That's all." Silence followed, the kind that measured a man. Tallulah crossed her arms, still guarded. Naya pulled the blanket tighter, but Ayana gave the smallest nod, as if she believed him or wanted to. The smell of coffee filled the room as it began to boil. Daniel pulled down a strip of dried meat and a sack of flour. He mixed dough clumsily, shaping it into rough biscuits and setting them in the pan. He wasn't a skilled cook, but hunger softened judgment, and soon the sound of food cooking stirred all 3 women closer to the table. He laid the food out evenly, not keeping the best portion for himself. As they ate, questions unspoken in the first 2 chapters pressed forward now. Where had he come from? Why was he here? What did he truly want? Ayana was the one to give voice to them. You're not Apache. You don't belong to this place. Why step into their fight? Daniel sipped his coffee, eyes fixed on the rising steam. His mind turned back to years of service during the war, to the faces of men who had followed orders only to end broken, to women in burned towns who had no voice in their own lives. He answered slow, because I've seen what happens when no one steps forward. I've carried enough of that. Didn't want to carry more. The eldest tilted her head, skeptical but curious. So this was for your conscience. He met her look without flinching. Maybe, but it gave you a choice you didn't have before. The room quieted again. The only sounds the scrape of spoons and the hiss of the stove. It wasn't trust, not yet. But the lines of fear in their faces had shifted. When breakfast ended, Daniel set a bucket in Ayana's hands. Spring's close. Water's clear there. Path runs straight. Take one of the others if you go. She looked at him sharply, surprised he'd sent her out so soon. He caught that glance and explained. You need to see you're not prisoners here. Tallulah stood immediately. I'll go with her. It wasn't a request. She wanted to test his word, to see if his talk of freedom held true. Daniel opened the door, letting them pass. He stood in the threshold, rifle leaning in reach, but not raised, watching as the two women walked the trail down toward the spring. Naya lingered inside, folding the blanket neatly, her eyes darting to him every few seconds as though weighing whether the promise of safety could last. He watched the ridge while they were gone, every nerve sharp. If the men from a mesa wanted to take back what he had claimed, this would be their moment. But the woods held only the usual sounds. Wind through pine, a crow lifting off. When the two women returned, carrying the bucket heavy between them, Daniel saw something different in their faces. Tallulah's expression was still guarded, but there was less edge in her stare. Ayana's eyes softened slightly, as if she had tested the bars of a cage and found none. Daniel took the bucket, set it down, and spoke evenly. You'll have to decide how long you stay. But while you're here, this place is yours too. It was a simple statement, but it changed the air in the room. The youngest looked at him with something close to relief. The eldest with a silent challenge that was no longer pure suspicion. And the middle one, Ayana, with a weight of thought he could not yet read. That night, as he laid more wood in the stove and spread his coat once again by the door, Daniel realized something clear. The fight in the circle had been the easy part. What lay ahead, the slow work of proving his word, of earning their trust, would test him far harder. The storm broke by mid-morning, not thunder and rain, but a hard wind sweeping down off the mesa, carrying with it the smell of dust and pine needles. The cabin creaked under the gusts, the loose boards on the lean-to rattling like bones. Daniel had risen before the women, slipping outside to check the fence line. When he came back, his coat was dusted red from the wind, and his jaw was tight from thought. The three women were gathered close to the stove, hair loose, dresses still patched, but not enough to hide the years of wear. They looked at him as he came in, not with trust, not yet, but with the watchfulness of people who had learned that a man's promises rarely match his actions. He set the hammer and nails on the table. Roof's loose, needs mending before night. He didn't phrase it as a request. He had learned early that direction steadied fear. But before he could say more, Tallulah stood. We'll help. We didn't come here to sit useless. Her tone carried edge, a reminder that she was still testing him. Daniel gave a single nod. Good. Two hold the ladder, one hand me boards. Outside, under the gray light, the work took shape. Tallulah braced the ladder, while Ayana steadied the boards. Naya held a basket of nails, her hands trembling, but her feet planted firm. Daniel climbed, his boots finding the worn rungs. As he hammered the first plank into place, he felt Ayana's eyes on him. She didn't look away when he glanced down. For the first time since the fight in the circle, there was no accusation in her stare, only study, as if she was measuring what kind of man he truly was. By noon, the worst of the wind had passed, the roof held, and the cabin was steadier than the day before. Inside, they shared a thin stew. Daniel watched as the women moved about the small room with more ease now. Tallulah cutting cloth with deliberate care, Naya humming under her breath as she sewed a patch, and Ayana lifting the lid of the pot with a cloth-wrapped hand, testing the steam. It was a house in motion again, not just four strangers trapped under the same roof. Still, questions hung in the air, questions left unspoken in the first nights, but heavy enough that Daniel could almost hear them pressing against the silence. It was Ayana who gave voice to them, her words low and steady as she set the ladle aside. What happens when your people, your law, find out you brought us here? Will they come with chains? Daniel looked at her, then at Tallulah and Naya, who both waited for his answer. He leaned forward, forearms on the table, voice flat. White law won't touch you here. The justice in Willow Draw doesn't send his men this far unless there's coin in it. And I've got no debt and no bounty. If anyone comes, it won't be him. It'll be your own kin, wanting back what they think I took. Tallulah stiffened. And when they come? Daniel's jaw worked. He hated the truth, but he wouldn't soften it. Then we face it, but not with chains, not with force. Silence settled again, broken by the snap of the fire. Naya's hand trembled against the rim of her bowl. Tallulah's stare hardened, but Ayana leaned back slowly, as though the weight in her chest had shifted, not gone, but no longer crushing. That night, Daniel sat at the door, as always, rifle laid across his knees. The women slept closer together than before, their breathing less restless. When the latch rattled under a hard gust, Ayana startled awake. She sat up, eyes wide, until Daniel spoke quietly without turning his head. Just the wind. Her shoulders eased. For a long moment she stayed awake, watching him in the dim light of the dying fire. Then, slowly, she lay back down, the blanket pulled to her chin. He kept his eyes on the door, but he felt her trust settle like a fragile weight in the room. When dawn came, the land outside was quiet again. The storm had passed, but the questions had not. Daniel knew the days ahead would test all of them, not just with hunger or weather, but with the choices still waiting beyond the ridge. For now, though, the cabin stood solid, the stove gave heat, and four people who had been bound by law and violence were beginning, piece by piece, to carve a different kind of life. The morning after the storm, the cabin carried a different weight. The roof no longer leaked, the stove burned hot, and the women moved with a little more certainty than they had before. Yet a new question pressed against the silence. How long could they survive in this cabin with only scraps of flour and beans left? Listeners might have wondered why Daniel had not gone to town sooner, or whether he was hiding from the white law as much as he was from the Apache circle. The truth surfaced now. His supplies were thin, his coin pouch nearly empty, and the nearest trading post was Willow Draw, 2 hours by wagon over hard ground. If they stayed here, they would have to face that place and the eyes waiting for them. Daniel hitched his roan to the wagon just after sunrise, the leather reins stiff with cold. When he stepped back inside, the three sisters stood waiting, each with a different look in her eyes. Tallulah crossed her arms and said, "If you're going, we're not staying behind." Her words carried pride, but also fear of being left. Naya clutched her shawl tighter, torn between relief at staying hidden and the terror of being seen. Ayana simply met Daniel's eyes. "We'll walk in that place together, or not at all." He didn't argue. He only nodded once. "Then be ready. The town won't stay quiet when it sees you with me." The wagon jolted down the trail, wheels cutting into red dirt. The women sat on the bench beside him, pressed close for space. Naya's hand stayed folded in her lap, trembling each time the wagon struck a rock. Tallulah scanned the ridges, as though expecting men to ride down at any moment. Ayana kept her gaze on Daniel, steady, as if gauging whether his promise of protection would hold under the weight of stranger stares. When they reached Willow Draw, the town looked as it always did, a single street of weathered buildings, a saloon with broken shutters, a general store, and the justice's office with its door half open. A few men leaned against the rail outside the saloon. Their eyes followed the wagon. One spat into the dirt and muttered loud enough to carry. "White man brings squaws into town, must think himself a chief." Daniel felt the words cut through the air, but he didn't look their way. He stopped the wagon in front of the store, stepped down, and helped each woman onto the street. He kept his hand steady when Ayana placed hers in his, her touch firm but cautious. The three women stood together, shoulders squared, facing the whispers already spreading across the street. Inside the store, the air was close with the smell of flour and leather. The storekeeper, a heavy-set man with gray whiskers, glanced up from the counter. His eyes lingered too long on the women before shifting to Daniel. "You buying or trading?" "Buying," Daniel said flatly. He placed a small pouch of coins on the counter. Flour, salt, beans, and cloth enough for 3 dresses. The man's brows rose, but he didn't comment. He called to the boy in back to fetch the goods. While they waited, the women wandered cautiously through the aisles. Naya stopped at a shelf of buttons, running her fingers over them as if the small, ordinary objects were treasures. Tallulah picked up a bolt of sturdy calico, examining it with sharp eyes. Ayana stood at a rack of boots, testing the leather of a pair that looked close to her size. When she bent to check the soles, Daniel noticed the seam of her torn dress pulling higher at her thigh, the fabric frayed. His jaw tightened, not at her body, but at the memory of the circle where men had stared at her the same way. He turned away and cleared his throat. "Take them if they fit. I'll pay." Ayana straightened, surprised, then nodded once without speaking. As the storekeeper tallied the goods, a man entered, dust on his hat and a revolver at his hip. He looked at the scene, Daniel with 3 Apache women at his side, and let out a laugh. "You planning to sell him off, Kane? Or keep all 3 for yourself?" The words drew silence. Tallulah bristled, her eyes flashing. Naya shrank behind her sisters. Daniel's hand hovered near his belt, but he didn't draw. His voice came low, steady, carrying more weight than volume. "You'll hold your tongue." The man's smirk faltered under Daniel's stare. After a long pause, he shrugged, spat on the floor, and walked out. When the goods were loaded, Daniel guided the women back to the wagon. The street was still lined with stairs, but none stepped forward. As the wagon rolled out of town, Naya exhaled for the first time since they had arrived. "They hate us." Daniel tightened his grip on the reins. "Let them. They don't decide what happens in my house." The road back was quiet except for the creak of the wagon. Tallulah sat straight, jaw set, holding the cloth they had chosen. Naya clutched the buttons to her chest like a shield, and Ayana, her new boots in her lap, leaned slightly against Daniel, not enough to be bold, but enough to let him know the wall of mistrust had begun to crack. By the time the cabin came into sight, Daniel understood the cost of what they had done. The town knew. Gossip would spread. Word would travel up to the mesa. There would be consequences. But as he helped each woman down from the wagon, watching them carry the bundles inside like they belonged there, he also knew something else. There was no turning back. The wagon creaked back into its place near the corral, the roan shaking its head as Daniel unhitched the traces. The women carried the bundles inside, their arms full of cloth, salt, beans, and a sack of flour that would last through the next month if rationed carefully. It looked like enough to keep them alive, but Daniel knew survival wasn't measured by stores alone. The moment they had set foot in Willow Draw, eyes had followed them. Word would spread fast. By now, the Mesa would know he had not hidden the women, but taken them openly into town. The question that lingered in every listener's mind, what would the tribe do now, pressed on Daniel just as heavily. That answer came sooner than he expected. 2 days later, just after dawn, Daniel was chopping wood in the yard when movement along the ridge caught his eye. 2 men descended on foot, their pace slow but deliberate, their faces set in the expression of men who carried another's message. Daniel rested the axe against the block and wiped his brow, not reaching for the rifle, but aware of its place inside the door. He stepped forward to meet them before they came too close to the cabin. The women saw them too. Naya froze in the doorway, hands clutching the blanket around her shoulders. Tallulah moved in front of her like a wall, eyes hard. Ayana stayed just behind Daniel's left shoulder, silent but alert, her gaze following the stranger's every step. The taller of the 2 men spoke first, his voice even. "The chief still breathes. His bones ache, but they are not broken. He says the law of the circle was spoken true. Yet he wants words. At the cottonwood by the creek." Noon tomorrow. Daniel studied their faces, measuring tone and body. They carried no rifles, only short knives at their belts. It was no ambush, not yet. He nodded once. I'll come. The man tilted his head. Alone. Bring the women, if they choose. His eyes lingered on the three sisters, then returned to Daniel. No weapons drawn. The chief will bring none. Daniel gave a short breath through his nose. Then it will be so. When the two men turned back toward the ridge, the tension in the yard eased only slightly. Tallulah's jaw clenched. You shouldn't go. Daniel looked at her, then at the others. If I don't, they'll come here. With more men and less talk. Better to face it in the open. That night, the cabin was heavier than usual. The stew on the table went mostly untouched. Naya barely spoke, staring at her bowl. Tallulah asked questions sharp as nails. What if they demand us back? What if they call your word nothing? And Daniel answered each one the same. Then you choose in front of them, not behind. It was Ayanna who finally asked the question none of them had dared put into the air yet. And if we say we stay? Daniel looked at her across the table, the lamplight showing the lines of her face, the determination mixed with fear. His voice was quiet, steady. Then I stand by it. Whatever comes after. The words hung there, plain and final. By dawn, preparations for the meeting were simple but deliberate. Daniel cleaned his rifle but left it behind, carrying only the weight of his own resolve. The women dressed in what they had managed to mend with the cloth from willow draw, still patched, but less torn than before. Tallulah tied her hair back like a warrior. Naya's hands shook as she buttoned the dress Daniel had bought her. Ayanna wrapped herself in a shawl, her movements steady, her eyes betraying nothing. When they stepped out together, for figures against the rising sun, the cabin behind them looked less like a refuge and more like a claim. And Daniel knew that whatever happened under the cottonwood by the creek, the line between law, choice, and survival would be drawn in front of them all. The path to the creek was narrow and uneven, the kind that forced silence on anyone walking it. Daniel led with steady steps, his hand near his belt though no weapon showed. The women followed close, each carrying her own fear differently. Tallulah's chin was lifted, her stride sharp and unbending, as if daring anyone who watched to test her resolve. Naya walked half a step behind her sisters, clutching the shawl tight against her chest, her eyes darting to every sound in the brush. Ayanna kept her gaze ahead, her face calm, but her thoughts restless. She had not asked Daniel again what would happen if their father demanded their return. She already knew his answer, but the weight of that choice pressed heavier the closer they drew to the cottonwood. When they reached the clearing, the air was still. The creek ran low, its water clear over the stones, and the old cottonwood cast a long shadow. The chief was there, seated on a flat rock, leaning on his staff. His nephews stood a short distance back, arms folded, knives at their belts, but no rifles in sight. The old man's face was worn deeper since the fight, the lines carved hard into his cheeks, but his eyes burned sharp as ever. Daniel stopped at a respectful distance. He did not bow, did not lower his head, but neither did he posture. He waited. The chief spoke slowly, each word heavy with the strain of pride and age. By my word, you beat me. By my word, they were given. By law, they are yours. But law without choice is only a cage. So I call them here to answer with their own tongues. He turned to his daughters. His eyes softened when they met Naya's. Do you wish to return? Naya's throat worked before she found her voice. I want to stay where the stove is warm, where I can sleep without waking to fear. I'll not go back. Her words were quiet, but they carried across the clearing. The old man's eyes shifted to Tallulah. She stood taller, shoulders squared. I will not be wife to Daniel Kane. I will not return to the circle either. I will stand here as elder sister and help keep the house if that's what life brings. My choice is mine, not yours, not theirs. The chief's jaw tightened, but he gave a small nod. Then his gaze settled on Ayanna, the middle one, the one who had not broken eye contact even in the circle of men. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled at her sides. I stay. With him. Not by your word, not by the fight, but because he gave me breath when you gave me away. She looked at Daniel then, not as a man who had won her, but as the one she had chosen. I will build a life here, as his. The silence that followed was longer than any before. The nephew shifted, uneasy, but did not move. The chief drew a slow breath, closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, the fight in them had dimmed. He struck his staff against the ground once, sharp. So it is spoken, and so will be. Daniel nodded, relief buried deep under the hardness of his expression. Then it settled, but the chief wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his voice carrying a final warning. You've made your claim in front of me, Cain. If ever my daughters say otherwise, if ever they are harmed or their choice is stolen, I will not send nephews. I will come myself, even if it takes the last of my bones. Daniel met his eyes, unflinching. Fair. The old man pushed himself to his feet, his body heavy with age, and turned back toward the ridge. His nephews followed, their footsteps fading into the brush until only the creek's trickle remained. The clearing was quiet again. Tallulah crossed her arms, exhaling a breath she had held too long. Naya's eyes filled, her shoulders easing as if a burden she had carried all her life had been set down. Ayanna stepped closer to Daniel, her hand brushing his arm in the first unguarded gesture since the circle. Daniel looked at each of them, then at the path leading back to the cabin. For the first time since this had begun, the road ahead was not chained by another man's word. It was theirs to walk, hard, uncertain, but chosen. The walk back from the creek was different than the one that had carried them there. The women were quiet, but not from fear. Their shoulders no longer pressed in as if expecting to be pulled away. Tallulah walked slightly ahead, scanning the path with the same sharpness as always, but her steps were lighter. Naya stayed in the middle, her hand brushing the cloth of the shawl she carried like it was no longer only protection, but something of her own. Ayanna walked beside Daniel, not touching, but close enough that he felt her presence as steady as the ground under his boots. When the cabin came into view, it no longer looked like a shelter meant for one man's silence. With the roof patched, smoke rising from the chimney, and blankets drying on the line, it had begun to take on the shape of a household. Listeners might have wondered how they would make it through the winter, how 4 people could survive in a cabin built for one. And those questions found their answers in the days that followed. The next morning, Daniel carried the last of the split logs under the lean-to, stacking them high. Tallulah joined him without being asked, taking up the axe and splitting kindling with strong, sharp strokes. When Daniel moved to correct her stance, she shook her head. I've watched enough men swing an axe. I don't need teaching. Daniel only nodded and let her work. For the first time, her tone carried no bite, just determination. Inside, Naya worked the cloth from willow draw into patches and then into new garments. Her stitches were uneven at first, her fingers shaking with every pass of the needle, but she kept at it. By the 3rd day, she had pieced together a dress that hung straight, with buttons she had chosen herself. When she tried it on, she looked down at her own work with a shy smile. Daniel saw it from the doorway and said nothing, but the relief in her face was worth more than words. Ayanna took to the stove, her movements confident and steady. She boiled beans, cut strips of venison Daniel had brought back from a hunt, and flavored stews with pinches of salt they could now spare. She moved like someone reclaiming rhythm she thought she had lost. Daniel noticed the way she tested the pot with the back of her hand, careful not to waste heat, the way she cut meat into even strips as if each piece carried weight. At night, when the cabin smelled of smoke and stew, she was the one to set the bowls out, her eyes flicking to him as if waiting for his approval. One evening, when the others had gone quiet, Daniel stayed outside to finish mending the gate that always leaned to the east. Ayanna came out with a lantern, the light catching the lines of her face, her hair pulled into a loose braid. She held the wood steady while he hammered nails, her hand brushing his once when the board shifted. She didn't pull away. You don't have to do all this, she said softly. Daniel kept his eyes on the board. If I don't, it falls apart. She studied him for a moment before answering. I wasn't talking about the gate. He stopped, meeting her eyes in the lantern light. She didn't look away. The weight of the weeks, of silence, of mistrust, of watching each other, stood between them. Daniel felt the pull to reach for her, to close the distance, but he held himself steady. Restraint had carried him this far, and breaking it too soon would undo everything. Instead, he set the hammer down, straightened, and took the lantern from her. "It's fixed." Her lips curved, just slightly, into something close to a smile. She turned and walked inside, leaving him in the yard with the sound of the creak and the steady glow of the cabin windows. The next day, they rode into Willow Draw to sign papers at the justice's office. Daniel hadn't told them earlier, but he knew words spoken under the cottonwood would mean little if trouble came from the town side. Inside the cramped office, the justice looked at them with tired eyes, but said nothing more than necessary. Daniel signed where told, Ayanna beside him, her hand steady on the pen. Tallulah and Naya added their names too, marking their place in the household. The justice stamped the seal and set the papers aside with a grunt. Now no one can say they ain't where they want to be. On the ride home, the women were quiet, but the silence felt different than before. It was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of something settled. That night, when the stove burned bright and the papers hung nailed to the wall, the cabin felt less like a shelter against the world and more like the beginning of a life built by choice. And though Daniel said nothing, sitting with his rifle across his knees as always, he knew the questions that had haunted him since the fight in the circle had their answer. They had chosen to stay, and that meant the burden was his to carry, but it was no longer his alone. Winter settled early that year, the kind that tested whether a cabin was only walls or a true home. Frost clung to the window panes. The creek ran slower under a thin sheet of ice, and the woodpile shrank with each passing week. Yet inside, the cabin no longer carried the hollow silence it once had. There was rhythm now, a steady pattern of work and rest, of voices mingling where there had once been only one man's quiet. Tallulah rose with Daniel most mornings, taking the axe before he could argue and splitting kindling with firm, clean strokes. She no longer challenged him at every turn, but spoke in short, practical words about fences, wood, and the needs of the household. Naya kept to the stove and the sewing, her hands steadier than before, the fear in her eyes giving way to focus. She hummed softly as she worked, a sound so ordinary it filled the cabin with a warmth no fire could match. Ayanna had taken her place beside Daniel without ever needing to say it aloud. She worked alongside him, steadying posts, carrying water, cooking meals, and walking the fence line in the cold evenings. When his hand brushed hers as they carried aboard, she didn't move away. When he set a blanket over her shoulders at night, she met his eyes and gave the smallest nod. Their bond had shifted from unspoken to undeniable. Listeners might have wondered whether their union would ever be made clear, whether Daniel would remain a man haunted by restraint or step forward into the life Ayanna had already chosen. That answer came on a clear morning when snow still clung to the ridge. Daniel had shaved that day, his scar pale against clean skin, and wore his coat buttoned as if bracing himself for something more than the cold. He called them outside, all three sisters, to stand before the cabin. His words came slow, but each one was measured. When I stepped into that circle, I didn't know what I was doing. I only knew I couldn't walk away. Since then, you've each shown me what this house can be. Tallulah, you've stood like a wall against anything that threatened. Naya, you've worked until your hands remembered steadiness. And Ayanna, he paused, his voice tightening, you've given me something I thought I'd buried with the war. A reason to stay. Ayanna's eyes glistened, her breath hanging white in the cold air. Daniel reached into his coat and pulled out a small copper band, hammered from strip he had traded for at the post, rough but strong. He held it out to her. Not by law, not by fight, but by choice. Will you be my wife? Her answer came without hesitation. Yes. Her voice was clear, steady, stronger than he had ever heard it. She stepped into him, placing her hand in his, and he slid the ring onto her finger. The world around them felt still, as though even the wind had stopped to hear it. Tallulah looked away quickly, hiding the trace of a smile. Naya clutched her shawl close. tears brimming, but her lips curved upward. That night, they set the table for a supper different from all the others. Tallulah tied a length of ribbon in Ayana's hair. Naya laid out the new quilt she had sewn across the bed, and Daniel set the copper cup he had kept hidden at Ayana's place. The four of them ate stew thick with venison and beans, steam rising into the lamplight. Later, when the fire had burned low, Daniel and Ayana sat on the porch, the snow reflecting pale light around them. He pulled her close, her head resting against his chest, and for the first time he allowed himself to relax fully, the weight of silence no longer a burden but a comfort. She turned her face toward him and kissed him, slow and unhurried, the kind of kiss that sealed not just desire but permanence. Inside, the papers from the justice hung on the wall. The cabin stood firm against the cold. And for the first time since the circle on the mesa, there were no unanswered questions, no threats pressing from the outside. What had begun as law and fear had ended as choice and family. The story closed not with conquest, but with four people bound by the decision to remain. A cabin no longer built, for one stood full, its fire steady, its doors open only to those who belonged. Daniel Kane, once a drifter with no place, had become a man with a home. And Ayana, once given away as property, now stood as his wife by her own word. The winter pressed on, but inside that house, they had already found what mattered most: a life chosen and a home that would last.